Most men die chasing gold. Dalton Crest found enough to buy a kingdom, then buried it and walked away. That single choice should have saved him. Instead, it destroyed everything he'd ever believe about honor, love, and the cost of doing what's right. Because 13 years later, the debt came due in a way that would make him wish he'd just taken the gold and died rich. The canyon was silent when Dalton found it. Too silent. The kind of quiet that makes your skin crawl, that tells you you're somewhere you shouldn't be. His horse had gone lame 2 days back, and his canteen had been dry for 12 hours. The sun was killing him slowly, and he knew it. Then he saw the glint. Gold. Pure, thick as his forearm, running through the rock face like God himself had painted it there. Dalton's hands moved before his brain caught up, scraping dirt, pulling away stone. This wasn't just gold. This was everything. Enough to buy land, cattle, a future, enough to stop being nobody and become somebody. His fingers closed around a chunk small enough to pocket, valuable enough to feed him for months. But something stopped him cold. The air felt wrong, heavy, like the canyon itself was watching him. Dalton stood there, gold in his hand, thinking about every grave he'd passed in 15 years of drifting. Men who died fighting over less than this. Men whose names nobody remembered anymore. Just their greed, carved into wooden crosses that rotted in the rain. He put the gold back, covered the vein like tucking in a child, made it look untouched. Then he kept walking with his dying horse and his empty hands, knowing he might not survive the day. But somehow, dying of thirst felt cleaner than living with gold-stained hands. The Apache found him at sundown. 6 warriors materialized from the rocks like shadows coming alive. Their leader was a man with gray threading through dark hair, eyes that missed nothing, a face marked by weather and war. He moved like death given human form, and Dalton knew immediately this was someone who decided who lived and who didn't. "You crossed into protected ground," the leader said in perfect English, his tone flat as the blade in his hand. "What did you take?" Here was the moment. Dalton could lie. Should lie. These men would never know about the gold if he kept his mouth shut. But something in that leader's eyes made lying feel more dangerous than the truth, like the man could see straight through to your soul and count every lie you'd ever told. "Found a gold vein in the canyon wall," Dalton said, his voice cracked from thirst. "Touched it, but I left it alone. Covered it back up." The warriors exploded into rapid conversation, their tones sharp, disbelieving, angry. One of them looked ready to put an arrow through Dalton's throat right then. The leader raised his hand for silence, his eyes never leaving Dalton's face. "Why would you leave it?" "Wasn't mine to take. Seemed like sacred ground. Felt wrong." The leader studied him for what felt like an hour compressed into 30 seconds. Then he made a gesture, and 2 warriors lowered their weapons. "I am Natan. You will come with us. We will give you water, and we will see if you speak truth." They took him back to the canyon, made him show them exactly where he'd found the gold. When they uncovered the vein and saw it untouched, saw how carefully he'd hidden it again, something shifted in Natan's expression. Something that might have been respect, or surprise, or calculation. Most white men would have died before walking away from this much gold, Natan said, running his hand over the exposed vein. "Why are you different?" Dalton thought about his father drinking himself to death over a claim that never paid out. About his brother shot in the back over a disputed boundary. About all the ugliness he'd seen men do to each other over shining metal that didn't care who died for it. "Because I've seen what gold does to people. Turns them into something less than human. Whatever I might have gained from taking it, I'd have lost something more valuable." Natan looked at him for a long time. Then he nodded slowly. "You will leave this place now. You will never speak of what you found here. If you do, if any white man comes looking for this gold because of your words, we will know. and you will not die quickly. You have my word." "A white man's word," one of the warriors spat with disgust, but Natan held up his hand again. "This one I believe. Go. We will give you water and point you toward the settlement. But remember, some debts take many seasons to repay. The earth does not forget what is owed." Dalton walked away from more wealth than he'd ever see again, not understanding what Natan's words really meant, not understanding that debts could be paid in ways that had nothing to do with gold, and not knowing that a small girl had been watching from the rocks that day, watching her father spare the white man's life, watching this stranger walk away from fortune. She was only 5 years old then, but she'd remember his face, remember the moment her father called him honorable. And 13 years later, when she stood before that same man as a woman grown, she would hate him for it. 13 years can hollow out a man in ways you can't see from the outside. Dalton had built himself a small ranch on land nobody else wanted, the kind of stubborn ground that fought you for every blade of grass. He'd chosen it because it was remote, because the nearest neighbor was a day's ride away, because out here his past couldn't find him. Or so he thought. He was mending fence when he saw them coming. 3 riders moving slowly across the open land, their approach deliberate, unhurried. Dalton straightened, his hand moving instinctively toward the rifle leaning against the fence post, then stopping. Something about the way they rode told him this wasn't ordinary trouble. As they drew closer, recognition hit him like cold water. The lead rider was Natan, older now, more gray in his hair, but unmistakable. Behind him rode a younger warrior, and beside that warrior, a young woman. Dalton's hands went still on the fence wire. His mind raced through possibilities, none of them making sense. Natan raised his hand in greeting as they stopped 20 feet away. "You remember me?" It wasn't a question. "I remember," Dalton said slowly. "Gave you my word I'd never speak of that place. Haven't broken it." "I know. We have been watching. For 13 seasons we have watched you. Seen how you live alone, working this hard land, never taking what isn't yours, never speaking of what you found." A chill ran down Dalton's spine despite the afternoon heat. 13 years of being watched without knowing it. The thought should have angered him, but he understood it. Trust had to be earned, especially between their peoples, especially after centuries of broken promises and blood. "What brings you here?" Dalton asked, his voice steady despite the unease crawling through his gut. Natan dismounted with practiced ease. The young warrior and the woman stayed mounted, both watching Dalton with expressions he couldn't read. The woman's face was striking, all sharp angles and dark eyes that seemed to burn with something Dalton couldn't name. Anger, maybe. Or hatred. "You showed honor when honor was rare," Natan said, walking closer. "You chose respect over wealth. In my culture, such a debt must be repaid. It has taken 13 years to find the proper payment. 13 years for my daughter to reach womanhood and make her own choices." Dalton's gaze shifted to the young woman on the horse. His stomach dropped as understanding began to dawn, terrible and impossible. "Among my people," Natan continued, his voice formal now, weighted with ceremony. "When a man shows such honor, he is worthy of our highest respect. You saved our sacred place. You kept your word. Now I offer you what I value most, my daughter. If you will have her, she is of age now. She understands what is offered." Dalton's mouth went dry. He looked at the young woman again, saw the rigid set of her shoulders, the way her hands gripped the reins so tight her knuckles had gone pale. Her face was a mask of barely controlled fury, and in her eyes he saw nothing but contempt. "I can't," Dalton started, then stopped. "How did you refuse a gift like this without insulting a man who'd traveled 13 years to offer it?" "She doesn't want this." "What she wants is not the question," the young warrior said sharply. "What is owed is owed." but Natan raised his hand for silence. She has been told of your honor. She has been raised knowing this debt would be paid. She has agreed to come as our tradition requires. What you build from here, that is between you and her. Dalton felt trapped in a moment he couldn't escape, caught between honor and horror. He looked at the young woman again, saw the hatred simmering in her dark eyes, and knew with absolute certainty that accepting would be cruel to them both. But refusing might be crueler still, might shame her, might insult Natan in ways Dalton couldn't begin to understand. "I'm twice her age," Dalton said quietly. "I live alone because I'm better that way. I have nothing to offer her." "You have honor," Natan replied. "That is everything." The young woman finally spoke, her English accented but clear, each word sharp as broken glass. "Do not pretend you are doing me a favor by refusing. The debt is real. I will stay." And somehow those words, filled with resentment and anger, sealed Dalton's fate more completely than any ceremony could have. Because he understood then that refusing would shame her more than accepting, that he was trapped by the same honor that had made him walk away from gold 13 years ago. He was about to learn that some rewards came with a cost he'd never imagined paying. Natan left before sunset. He placed his daughter's few belongings inside Dalton's cabin without ceremony, spoke to her briefly in their language, then mounted his horse. The young woman stood rigid as a fence post, watching her father ride away, her face revealing nothing. Dalton stood awkwardly near the corral, feeling like an intruder in his own life. When the riders disappeared over the ridge, the silence that fell was thick enough to choke on. "I have a name," she said suddenly, still staring at the empty horizon. "It is not her or the woman. It is Kimala." "That's a good name," Dalton said, clearing his throat. "What does it mean? Why would you care?" She turned to face him then, and the contempt in her eyes hit him like a physical blow. "You got what you wanted. A woman to cook, to clean, to warm your bed. Isn't that what all white men want?" "That's not—" Dalton stopped, realizing anything he said would sound hollow. "I didn't ask for this." "Neither did I." She walked past him toward the cabin, her movements sharp with anger. "But here we are, bound by my father's honor and your supposed virtue 13 years ago. Tell me, was leaving that gold really about respect, or were you just too cowardly to take what you wanted?" The words stung, because they touched something Dalton had wondered himself over the years. Had it been honor or fear, respect or weakness? He'd never been entirely sure. "Believe what you want," he said quietly. "But I'm not going to force anything on you. You can have the cabin. I'll sleep in the barn." She stopped at the cabin door, her hand on the frame. For a moment, something flickered across her face. Surprise, maybe, or suspicion. Then the mask of anger returned. "How generous. The white man gives me permission to sleep in his house while he plays the martyr in the barn." She disappeared inside, slamming the door hard enough to make the frame shudder. Dalton stood in the fading light, feeling older than his 41 years. He'd faced down claim jumpers, survived 3 harsh winters with nothing but determination, rebuilt his life from nothing. But this woman, this angry young woman who hated him for reasons both fair and unfair, might be the challenge that finally broke him. That night, lying in the barn's loft with horses shifting below, Dalton couldn't sleep. He kept thinking about Kimala alone in the cabin, probably crying or raging or both. Part of him wanted to check on her, make sure she had everything she needed, but he knew that would only make things worse. She needed space, time, maybe years of it. What he didn't know was that Kimala wasn't crying. She was sitting on the edge of the bed, her mother's necklace clutched in her fist, remembering the day raiders burned their camp, remembering her mother's screams, and hating herself for the tiny, treacherous part of her mind that whispered this white man might be different. That whisper felt like betrayal, like forgetting her mother's death. like surrendering to the enemy. She wouldn't surrender. She'd make him regret accepting her father's offer. She'd make him understand what it felt like to be trapped by someone else's choices, even if it destroyed them both. The first 2 weeks passed like walking through broken glass. Every interaction drew blood in small ways that left no visible wounds, but hurt just the same. Kimala cooked meals so spicy Dalton could barely swallow them, then accused him of rejecting her culture when his eyes watered and his throat burned. She rearranged his tools, moved his belongings, claimed spaces in the cabin that had been his for years. Dalton let her. He ate the burning food without complaint, found his tools wherever she'd put them, gave her more space than the small cabin really allowed. He slept in the barn every night, woke before dawn to work, spoke to her only when necessary. She hated that most of all. "Why don't you yell at me?" she demanded one morning when he found his best saddle moved to the far corner of the barn. "Why don't you put me in my place like you want to?" Dalton lifted the saddle, checking it for damage. "Because I don't want to put you anywhere. This is your home now, same as mine." "It will never be my home." She crossed her arms, blocking the barn door like she was daring him to move her physically. "And you are a liar if you say you don't resent me for disrupting your comfortable, lonely life." He met her eyes, saw the challenge there, the desperate need to make him into the villain she wanted him to be. "I didn't ask for this situation. Neither did you. But I'm not going to take my frustration out on you just because you need me to." She flinched like he'd struck her. Her jaw tightened, and for a moment he saw something beneath the anger, pain maybe, or fear. Then it was gone, buried under fresh contempt. "You think you're so much better than other white men, so noble, so patient. But I know what you really want." Dalton picked up his saddle and walked toward the door. She didn't move, forcing him to stop inches from her. He could smell the sage she used in her hair, see the pulse beating in her throat. This close, he could also see how young she really was, how scared. "What I want," he said quietly, "is for you to stop hurting yourself, trying to hurt me. I'm not your enemy, Kimala. You're worse than an enemy. You're a cage that calls itself shelter." He stepped around her carefully, giving her plenty of room, and headed toward the corral. Behind him, he heard her sharp intake of breath, like his refusal to engage had somehow wounded her more than anger would have. The pattern repeated itself daily. She would provoke. He would remain calm. Her frustration would build like storm clouds gathering on the horizon, dark and dangerous and ready to break. But something else was building too, something neither of them wanted to acknowledge. The way Dalton's hand would linger on a fence post after she'd touched it. The way Kimala's eyes would follow him when she thought he wasn't looking. The careful dance they did around each other in the small cabin, always aware of where the other was, always making sure they didn't accidentally touch. It was a different kind of torture, this awareness, and it was only going to get worse. 3 weeks in, Dalton noticed she'd started wearing one of his old shirts when she worked. It was too large for her, hanging past her hips, sleeves rolled up multiple times. She caught him looking and glared. "My dress was impractical for the work. Don't read anything into it." "Wasn't going to," he said. But he'd noticed she'd mended a tear in the shirt before wearing it. Small, careful stitches that spoke of consideration she'd never admit to feeling. And that tiny act of care, hidden in anger's clothing, gave him hope he tried very hard to suppress. Because hope, in a situation like this, felt more dangerous than despair. The real test came on a morning when storm clouds gathered fast. Dalton was working on the cabin roof, replacing damaged shingles, when his foot slipped on wet wood. He fell hard, landing flat on his back. The wind knocked clean out of his lungs. For a moment he just lay there, staring at the sky, unable to breathe, wondering if he'd broken something important. Then Kimala appeared above him, her face pale, her hands hovering over him like she wanted to help, but didn't know how, or didn't want to reveal she cared enough to try. "Are you hurt?" The question came out sharp, but her eyes betrayed her. Dalton managed to draw a breath, testing his ribs. Nothing broken, just bruised pride and an aching back. "I'm fine. Just had the breath knocked out of me." She knelt beside him, and for just a moment, just a heartbeat, her hand touched his shoulder. Light as a bird landing. Then she snatched it back like she'd touched fire. "You're an idiot for working on wet wood," she said, standing quickly. "If you died, I'd have been blamed for it." She walked away before he could respond, but Dalton lay there a moment longer, feeling where her hand had been. It wasn't much, barely anything at all, but it was the first time she'd touched him willingly, even in concern disguised as self-interest. That night, he found a plate of food left outside the barn door. Still hot. She'd made it less spicy this time. The wall between them hadn't fallen, but more cracks were forming, and through those cracks, something dangerous was beginning to seep through. Something that felt like the beginning of forgiveness or understanding, or something even more terrifying than hatred. Something that felt like the first whispers of love. When Dalton said he needed to go to town for supplies, Kimala announced she was coming too. Not asked. Announced. Dalton tried to warn her. The town wasn't kind to Apache, but she insisted, her eyes daring him to refuse. So they rode together through the long day, mostly silent, both conserving energy for what lay ahead. The settlement appeared as the sun started its descent, a collection of rough buildings that looked like they'd been thrown together by men too tired to care about beauty or permanence. Dalton felt Kimala stiffen beside him as they rode in, saw how people stopped to stare, how conversations died mid-sentence. Inside the general store, the clerk, a thin man named Porter with a face like worn leather, froze when he saw Kimala. "Didn't know you kept company with savages now, Crest," Porter said, making the word ugly, making it a weapon. Dalton felt something cold settle in his chest. "She's my wife. I'd appreciate you speaking respectfully." Porter's eyebrows rose. "Your wife? You married an Apache?" He laughed, but there was no humor in it, just cruel amusement. "Guess living alone that long will make a man desperate." Kimala's face remained carefully blank, but Dalton saw her hands curl into fists. He stepped forward, placing himself between her and Porter. "I need flour, salt, coffee, and ammunition. You going to sell it to me, or do I need to take my business elsewhere?" "Where else you going to go? Next town's 3 days' ride." Porter started gathering supplies, but kept talking. "Just surprised is all. Thought you had more sense than to bed down with their kind. They're animals, Crest. Everyone knows it." The cold in Dalton's chest spread. "Say that again." Something in his voice made Porter look up. The store had gone quiet. 2 other customers stood near the back, watching with the hungry attention of people who sensed violence coming. "I said," Dalton continued, his voice low and hard, "say that again about my wife." Porter's face flushed. "Now look, I didn't mean nothing personal about her specifically, but you know how they are. Can't trust them. Probably just waiting for her chance to slit your throat and steal whatever you got." Dalton reached across the counter and grabbed Porter's shirt, pulling him close. The move was sudden enough that Porter dropped the bag of flour he'd been holding. "Listen to me carefully," Dalton said, each word sharp as a knife. "You'll wrap up my supplies, you'll take my money, and you'll keep your ignorant mouth shut about things you don't understand, because the woman you just insulted has more honor in one finger than you've got in your whole worthless body." Porter's face had gone from flushed to pale. "You threatening me, Crest?" "I'm educating you. There's a difference." Dalton released him. "Now finish loading my supplies." The store stayed silent as Porter worked, his hands shaking slightly. One of the men near the back spat on the floor and left. The other followed. Dalton knew what that meant. The story would spread. He'd be known as the man who chose an Apache over his own kind. he'd lose what little standing he had in this settlement. He paid without another word, loaded the supplies, and helped Kimala mount her horse. They rode out with eyes following them, whispers rising in their wake like dust. They were an hour out when Kimala finally spoke. "You just destroyed your reputation for me." "It wasn't much of a reputation to begin with. Those men will spread stories. They'll say you've gone native, that you can't be trusted, you won't be welcome there anymore." "Then I won't go there anymore." Dalton kept his eyes on the trail ahead. Plenty of other places to get supplies, even if they're farther. She was quiet for a long moment. When she spoke again, her voice had changed, softer, uncertain in a way he'd never heard from her. "Why did you do that?" "Because what he said was wrong, and because you didn't deserve to hear it. But I'm nobody to you, just a debt your honor forced you to accept." Dalton finally looked at her. In the fading light, her face had lost some of its hardness, some of the armor she kept welded in place. "You're my wife," he said simply. "Maybe not by choice, maybe not by love. But that still means something to me. Means I don't let people disrespect you." She stared at him, and for the first time since she'd arrived at his ranch, he saw the anger in her eyes waver. It wasn't acceptance. It wasn't even forgiveness. But it was the first sign that maybe, just maybe, the wall between them had a crack big enough to actually see through. A crack that might, given time, become a door. The morning after they returned from town, Dalton woke to find his coffee already made and breakfast cooking over the fire. Kimala stood with her back to him, her posture less rigid than before. When he approached, she didn't flinch or move away. "Thank you," he said quietly. She shrugged without turning. "You defended me yesterday. This is just food." But they both knew it was more than that. Over the following days, something shifted between them. Not dramatically, not with grand gestures or spoken declarations, just small changes that accumulated like snow on a branch, barely noticeable until suddenly the weight was undeniable. She stopped moving his tools, started asking questions about the ranch work instead of pretending she already knew everything. When a section of fence needed mending, she worked beside him without being asked, her hands quick and efficient. They fell into a rhythm, passing tools back and forth without words, their movements synchronized in a way that only came from paying attention to each other. One evening, Dalton found her sitting outside the cabin, staring at the sunset. He hesitated, then sat on the ground a respectful distance away. They watched the sky turn from gold to red to purple without speaking. It should have been awkward. Instead, it felt like the first peaceful moment they'd shared. "My mother died when I was 10, Kimala said suddenly, her voice so quiet he almost missed it. "Raiders. White men looking for easy targets. They burned our camp, took what they wanted, left death behind them." Dalton's throat tightened. He wanted to say he was sorry, that not all white men were like that, but the words felt hollow before he could speak them. "I was hiding in the rocks. I saw everything." She pulled her knees to her chest, making herself smaller. "My father found me 3 days later. I hadn't moved, hadn't eaten. I just kept thinking that if I stayed still enough, quiet enough, they might forget I existed." "Is that why you—" Dalton stopped, unsure how to finish. "Why I hated you on sight." She finally looked at him, and her eyes were dry but haunted. "Yes. Every white face reminds me of that day. Every white man is one of them, until proven otherwise. And even then, I keep waiting for the proof to be a lie." "I understand," Dalton said, and meant it. "My father drank himself to death chasing gold that never existed. My brother was shot over a claim dispute. Violence follows gold and land like flies follow rot. I've seen enough of it to know that being white doesn't make a man good. Just makes him dangerous in different ways." She studied his face in the dimming light. "You really believe that?" "I've lived it." Something passed between them then. Not forgiveness, Not even trust yet, but recognition. Two people who'd been damaged by the same ugly world, trying to survive in their own ways, realizing they might not have to survive alone. "I sleep in the cabin now," Kimala said. "You should too. The barn is cold at night. It makes no sense for you to suffer there when there's space for both of us." Dalton's heart kicked against his ribs. "You sure?" "I wouldn't offer if I wasn't." She stood, brushing dust from her clothes. "But don't misunderstand. This isn't an invitation for anything beyond sleep. I'm just tired of feeling like I pushed you out of your own home." "I understand." That night, Dalton made a bed on the floor while Kimala took the actual bed. The space between them felt both vast and impossibly small. He lay awake, listening to her breathing, aware of every small sound she made, wondering if she was as conscious of him as he was of her. "Dalton." Her voice came soft through the darkness. "Yeah? Thank you. For what you said to that man in town. I never thanked you properly. You don't have to thank me for basic decency." She was quiet for a moment. "Most men wouldn't see it as basic. They'd see it as a sacrifice. You lost something real by defending me. And gained something more valuable." "What did you gain?" He thought about lying, giving some easy answer that wouldn't reveal too much. But she'd been honest with him about her pain. She deserved honesty in return. "Your respect, maybe, or at least the possibility of it. That's worth more than the good opinion of men like Porter." She didn't respond, but he heard her shift in the bed, turning toward where he lay. Through the darkness, he felt her gaze on him, considering, weighing, measuring. "You are different," she said finally. "I didn't want to see it. I wanted you to be like the others so I could hate you cleanly, but you keep proving me wrong." "Is that a bad thing?" "I don't know yet." Her voice carried something that might have been the beginning of warmth. "Ask me again in time." Dalton lay in the dark, listening to her breathing even out into sleep, and felt something he hadn't felt in years: hope. Dangerous, fragile hope that maybe this impossible situation could become something good. That maybe walking away from gold 13 years ago had led him to something infinitely more valuable. The wall between them hadn't fallen, but more cracks were forming with every passing day. And through those cracks, light was beginning to seep through. 3 months had passed since the day in town. The ranch had settled into rhythms that felt less like cohabitation and more like partnership. They worked together, ate together, shared the cabin with an ease that surprised them both. But they still kept careful distance. Still avoided touches that lasted too long. Still pretended the growing awareness between them didn't exist. Didn't pull at them like gravity, didn't make the air feel charged whenever they were close. That pretense shattered on a day when storm clouds gathered with dangerous speed. Dalton was working in the far pasture when he saw them coming, massive and black, the kind that brought lightning and flooding. He ran for the cabin, knowing Kimala was there alone, knowing the shutters needed to be secured before the wind tore them off. He found her struggling to secure them, the wind already tearing at the wooden slats. Without thinking, he came up behind her, reaching past her to grab the loose shutter. His chest pressed against her back for just a moment as he secured the latch. They both froze. The storm raged around them, but Dalton was suddenly aware of nothing except the warmth of her body against his, the way she fit perfectly in the space his arms created. He could smell sage in her hair, feel the rapid rise and fall of her breathing. "Sorry," he said, his voice rough. He started to step back. Her hand caught his wrist. "Don't." He stilled. Her fingers were small against his sun-darkened skin, her grip surprisingly strong. The wind howled, rain beginning to fall in heavy drops, but neither of them moved. "Kimala." She turned in the small space between him and the wall, and suddenly they were face to face. Close enough that he could see flecks of amber in her dark eyes, close enough that he could feel the heat coming off her skin. I've been trying not to feel this, she said, her voice barely audible over the storm. Trying to hate you. Trying to see you as my cage. But you're not, are you? You never were. No. Dalton's hand moved almost of its own accord, brushing a strand of wind-blown hair from her face. She didn't pull away. I've been trying not to feel it too. Thought it would be wrong. You were given to me like property. How could anything good come from that? But you never treated me like property. Her eyes searched his face. You gave me choices, space, respect, even when I threw it back in your face with contempt. Why? Because that's not who I am. His hand still hovered near her face, not quite touching. And because somewhere along the way you stopped being a debt I'd accepted and became someone I wanted to know, someone I wanted to deserve. The words hung between them, heavy with meaning. Rain pounded the roof now, the storm fully upon them. But inside this small space, the air felt charged with something more dangerous than lightning. I don't know how to do this, Kimala whispered. How to want someone I thought I'd hate forever. How to trust, when trust has only brought pain before. We could figure it out together, if you wanted. Dalton made himself take a half step back, giving her room to refuse. Or we could keep things as they are. I won't push. I promised you that from the beginning. She looked at him for a long moment, and he saw the war happening behind her eyes, fear battling something else, something that looked like hope or hunger or both. I'm tired of being afraid, she said finally. Tired of letting what happened to my mother control every choice I make. Those men took everything from me when I was 10. I won't let them take this too. Take what? Instead of answering, she rose on her toes and pressed her lips to his. It was brief, tentative, more question than answer. When she pulled back, her eyes were wide, surprised by her own boldness. Dalton stood frozen, his heart hammering so hard he was sure she could hear it. 13 years ago, he'd walked away from enough gold to buy everything he'd ever wanted. In this moment, he realized he'd been repaid with something infinitely more valuable. Not just a woman, not just a companion, but someone who'd chosen him despite every reason not to. Someone who'd fought her own fear and won. Was that? She stopped, uncertain for the first time since he'd known her. Did I misread? He answered by cupping her face gently, giving her every chance to pull away, to change her mind. When she didn't, when she leaned into his touch instead, he kissed her with all the patience he'd learned over these months. Gentle, careful, like she was something precious that might break if handled roughly. The storm raged outside. Inside, something else entirely was being born. When they finally broke apart, both breathing hard, Kimala rested her forehead against his chest. I don't know what happens now. Neither do I. Dalton's arms came around her, holding her close but not tight, always giving her the option to leave. But we'll figure it out together, if that's what you want. She looked up at him, and for the first time since she'd arrived at his ranch, she smiled. Really smiled. It transformed her face, made her look younger, lighter, like a weight had been lifted. Yes, she said simply. That's what I want. Outside, the storm continued, but inside the small cabin, two people who'd been strangers bound by duty had become something else entirely, something chosen, something real. And Dalton finally understood what Natan had meant all those years ago about debts taking time to repay. The Apache leader hadn't been punishing his daughter or rewarding Dalton. He'd been giving them both something they couldn't have found any other way, a chance at something neither of them knew they needed. A chance at love. 6 months after that storm, Dalton woke to find Kimala already up, standing in the doorway watching the sunrise. Something in her posture made him uneasy, too still, too thoughtful. What's wrong? He asked, coming to stand beside her. She didn't answer immediately. When she did, her voice was quiet. My father is coming. I saw the smoke signals yesterday from the ridge. He'll be here by midday. Dalton's stomach tightened. In all these months, Natan hadn't returned, hadn't checked on his daughter. Dalton had started to believe maybe the Apache leader had simply trusted his choice and let them be. Now, faced with the reality of Natan's return, he wondered what the man expected to find. "Are you worried?" Dalton asked carefully. "I don't know what I am." Kimala crossed her arms, a gesture he recognized as self-protection. "When he left me here, I hated him for it. Hated you. Thought I'd been traded like livestock to pay a debt I had no part in making. But now—" She turned to look at him, and her eyes were clear, certain. "Now, I need to tell him that the debt is paid, and that I'm staying by choice, not obligation." The words hit Dalton harder than he expected. He'd known things had changed between them, known she'd stopped fighting against their situation. But hearing her say it out loud, hearing her claim this life as her choice, made something in his chest expand until breathing was difficult. "You don't have to tell him that if it's not true," Dalton said, giving her one last chance to be honest. "If you want to leave, I'll take you back myself. No shame, no blame." She stepped closer, taking his hand, her fingers intertwining with his. "You still don't understand, do you? After all this time, after everything, you still think I might be here out of duty." She shook her head, but she was almost smiling. "I love you, you stubborn man. I don't know when it happened. Maybe when you defended me in town. Maybe when you shared your own pain with me. Maybe it was built from 1,000 small moments of respect and patience. But it's real. And I'm not leaving." Before Dalton could respond, before he could tell her that he loved her too, that she'd become the center of his world without him even realizing it, she kissed him, soft and sure and full of promise. They stood like that, wrapped in each other, until the sound of approaching horses made them pull apart. Natan rode up alone this time, his bearing as regal as Dalton remembered. But when he dismounted and saw them standing together, hand in hand, something in his stern face softened. "You look well, daughter," Natan said in his language. Kimala responded in kind, her voice strong and clear. They spoke for several minutes while Dalton stood awkwardly to the side, understanding nothing but the tone. It was respectful, honest, and ultimately warm. Finally, Natan switched to English, addressing Dalton directly. "She tells me you have treated her with honor, that you gave her choice when you could have demanded obedience, that you protected her when it cost you standing among your own people." "She deserved nothing less," Dalton said simply. Natan studied him for a long moment, then nodded slowly. 13 years ago, you walked away from gold that could have bought you everything. I told you then that the earth does not forget what is owed. I brought you my daughter as payment for that honor. But I see now the debt has been repaid in ways I did not expect." He turned to Kimala, speaking to her in Apache again. She responded, and Dalton caught his own name in the flow of her words. Whatever she said made Natan's expression shift into something that might have been approval, or satisfaction, or both. "My daughter says she chooses to stay," Natan said, looking between them. "Not because duty demands it, but because her heart does. This is the truest payment I could have offered. Not just a woman, but a woman who chooses freely. That is the rarest treasure." He clasped Dalton's shoulder, the gesture carrying weight. "You left gold in the ground and found something more valuable. Most men never learn that lesson. I'm glad my daughter found one of the few who did." Natan mounted his horse, but before leaving, he spoke once more to Kimala. This time, Dalton heard the warmth in the old warrior's voice, saw the quick brightness in Kimala's eyes as she embraced her father. Then Natan rode away, disappearing over the ridge as suddenly as he'd appeared. Kimala turned to Dalton, and in the morning light she looked radiant, happy in a way he'd never seen before. "He gave us his blessing," she said. said that 13 years ago you proved yourself worthy of respect. Today you proved yourself worthy of love. Dalton pulled her close, resting his chin on top of her head, feeling the steady beat of her heart against his chest. 13 years ago, he'd made a choice that seemed like it cost him everything, walked away from wealth that could have changed his life. But standing here with Kimala in his arms, understanding that she'd chosen him freely, that love had grown in the space where resentment once lived, he finally understood what real wealth meant. Gold stayed buried and worthless, but honor, respect, and love, those paid dividends that multiplied across years. The Apache had repaid him not with something taken, but with something earned, not with obligation, but with choice. And that made all the difference. Some debts took 13 years to repay, but when they finally were, they were worth every moment of the wait. If you enjoyed this story, click the video on your screen now to watch another unforgettable tale where destiny and courage collide in ways you never expected. Don't forget to subscribe and drop a comment. Let me know what you thought of Dalton and Kimala's journey. Your support means everything and helps us keep bringing you stories like these. Until next time, remember, sometimes the greatest treasure is the one you choose, not the one you find.